E te tī e te tā e ngā iwi e mātaki maina, kia ora, nau mai, and a very, very, very warm welcome to Kōrerorero. We begin an open Kōrerorero today with the following words. Tu tawa mai I runga, tu tawa mai I raro. Tu tawa mai I roto, tu tawa mai I waho kia tauai, te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katoa. I summon from above, below, within, and the surrounding environment the universal vitality and energy to infuse and enrich all present. Haumie, huie, taikie. We open Kōrerorero today with a chantal prayer in the indigenous Māori language from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kōrerorero originates from the Māori word kōrero, which means to chat, to converse, and to discuss, which aligns with our session today. Kōrerorero, conversations that matter. And the conversation that we're having with you is about rethinking the tourism business sector through COVID. My name is Ed Tuari, Chief Advisor Māori for Education New Zealand, Manapo ki te ao, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce you today to our moderator of Kōrerorero, Chelsea Heywood. Chelsea is a Kiwi living in Bogota, Colombia, and has spent time in Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. Chelsea studied cultural anthropology and linguistics at Te Herenga Victoria University of Wellington and previously worked in the New Zealand Ministries of Defence and Justice. Chelsea is currently the Marketing and Communications Manager for a Latin America New Zealand Business Council, also known as LANZBC Young Professional Network. Now, without further ado, kia ora Chelsea, and a very warm welcome, and over to you.
Kia ora, Ed, and thank you very much for that introduction. Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome everyone to our third Kōrerorero session. As Ed just said, my name is Chelsea Heywood, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager for the Latin America New Zealand Business Council's Young Professionals Network. I'm currently living in Colombia, and it's a privilege to be part of this Kōrerorero. As Ed explained, a Kōrerorero is a chat, a meaningful conversation, a discussion bringing in a variety of viewpoints. Usually, Education New Zealand has the opportunity to achieve this kind of thought exchange via a wide variety of face-to-face events throughout the year. But given the challenges of the global pandemic, this has meant that we've needed to be a little creative. So with these monthly online Kōrerorero sessions, Education New Zealand with the New Zealand Inc. partners in the region are seeking to provide a forum for the sharing of opinions and ideas, to engage with thought leaders and to have conversations that matter. Usually connections between New Zealand and Latin America are strong, and these Kōrerorero sessions have been designed to create a space to build on that bilateral cooperation, collaboration and innovation that our regions are seeking to achieve together. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but first I've got some housekeeping information for everybody tuning in today. So for those of you joining us by Zoom, this webinar will be recorded and sent to you in the next couple of days. You'll also be able to watch it later on our YouTube channel, Study in New Zealand. You can choose one of the two options for interpretation into either Spanish or Portuguese. Just click on the globe at the bottom of the screen so that you can change the audio. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box. Make sure you select the option to send your question to all panelists and attendees. Please make your questions in English if you can. The chat option can be used for comments and reactions, but we won't be taking questions from within the chat, just the Q&A section. If you need help or wish to be unmuted, please use the raise hand option. And you will receive a certificate of attendance if your attendance is for at least 50% of the session, and we'll send that to you over the next 10 days. So keep an eye on your mail. And for those of us joining via YouTube, you can place your questions or remarks in the comments section. If you want to receive a certificate of attendance, please email latinamerica@enz.gov.nz between today and tomorrow so we can issue this certificate. Please make sure you include your name on that email. And of course, we'll be collating these questions as we go, and we'll ask the panelists of a selection of those questions at the very end. So It is my pleasure to introduce to you today such a high level of panelists from across the business and academic board, starting with Luis Felipe Barrientos. Luis Felipe is a professional in industrial design from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, an expert in creativity applied to innovation. He has taught these areas in specializations and MBA programs at the Julio Garavito Colombian School of Engineering and the Sergio Arboleda University. He is currently the Vice President of Scaling and Innovation at iNNpulsa, Colombia, the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Agency of the Government of Colombia. So welcome, Luis Felipe. Douglas Pearce, another one of our panelists, is the Emeritus Professor of Tourism Management in the School of Management at Victoria University of Wellington. He has held short-term positions as visiting professor at the Universidad Austral de Chile in Valdivia and at the Universidad Federal de Paraná in Curitiba. His most recent research has focused on destinations and destination management. Douglas is an Emeritus Fellow of the International Academy of the Study of Tourism as well. So welcome, Douglas. Dr. Joanna Fountain is Senior Lecturer in Tourism, Faculty of Environment, Society and Design at Lincoln University. Her research focuses on wine tourism and cultural heritage. Joanna's research seeks to bring a social scientific understanding to rural stakeholders' perceptions and experiences of rural change, focused on community festivals, agri-food, and wine tourism and destination branding. She is interested also in wine consumer behavior and resilience in the wine industry. So if you're a wine fan, she is a great person to get to know. Dr. Christian Schott is an Associate Professor of Tourism Management in the Wellington School of Business and Government at Te Arenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. His research interests include the impacts of tourism, climate change, education for sustainability, virtual reality, education, and youth mobility. He is the recipient of the 2019 Te Arenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington Sustainability Excellence Award, and his research and conceptual work on virtual reality for sustainability education was presented the Bronze Award Oceania by the leading global education challenge Reimagine Education in 2019. And Karem Basulto opened the first Tourism New Zealand office in South America, based in Sao Paulo, Brazil, assuming the position of regional manager since December 2013. Karem brings over 25 years of experience in leading positions in the tourism market, including senior management roles at Emeritus, which is the Brazilian Tourism Board, and the Brazilian Luxury Travel Association. Karem holds a degree on hotel management and a post-graduation degree on sustainable development and environmental law. So once again, welcome everybody. It's great to have you joining us in this Kōrerorero today. And let's crack on with the first question, which each of our panelists will answer from their own perspective and expertise. So the first question for everyone, and we will start with Douglas, is around the world, the tourism sector has dealt with and survived from previous global and regional crises. How much do these situations, such as September 11 or the global health pandemic we're experiencing now, affect tourist perceptions and experiences? And how does the industry adapt to these changes? So Douglas, over to you.
Good morning, bon dia, buenas tardes. Past experience shows that the demand for tourism rebounds relatively quickly from global and regional crises like September 11th, SARS, or regional crises related to tsunamis or hurricanes. But global figures over the last 50 years show that, with the exception of the occasional blip, the pattern of growth has been continuous and visitor numbers have continued to increase. Most recently, there was a bit of a dip with the 2009 global financial crisis, but figures returned to their pre-crisis level the following year. So in general, there's a relatively quick return. However, what makes this situation today different is that the COVID-19 situation is much more far-reaching, much more devastating. The magnitude, duration are much greater than these previous events. Its impact also are clearly worldwide. It's ongoing, and there's much uncertainty still in terms of when, indeed, if a vaccine will become widely available. In terms of perceptions, New Zealand has received a lot of favourable coverage internationally due to its management of COVID-19, and this will undoubtedly have reinforced the various positive image that we have as a tourist destination. There undoubtedly exists a strong demand for travel to New Zealand. The issue, of course, at present is that tourists cannot come here due to the closure of our borders, a policy that has been in place since March. And it seems unlikely that even a limited reopening will occur in the near future, certainly not perhaps before the end of the year, and then initially only for selected markets such as Australia. And we get a similar situation, closures of international and domestic borders throughout the world, including in Latin America. So it's not so much an issue that perceptions are affecting travel plans in the short term, but it's simply our inability to travel due to border restrictions, lockdowns, and also a dramatic reduction in flights. But once restrictions ease and flights resume, I'm fairly confident that visitor numbers will quickly return to their pre-COVID levels because there'll be a large amount of pent-up demand. But in the meantime, as borders remain closed and interregional travel restrictions continue, businesses have had to adopt by downsizing, laying off staff, adjusting their marketing, pricing and products to attract more domestic tourists. Some are doing well, others have folded, and many basically are in survival mode, dependent on government support, and I'll come back to that later.
Excellent, thanks Douglas. I think that's a really good point that you raised, and we can touch on that later, as you mentioned, that it's not necessarily that perceptions have changed, but there is currently an inability to travel, which I think it is important to remember. And Karem, how about you? Same question.
Yes, well, I think just complementing everything that Douglas said, I think what we have seen in all those crises is some changes on the behavior of the visitors. And I think what I would see is, let's say, the pent-up demand will be huge. I think what we have seen, people were really willing to travel, but they will be looking for a destination that have dealt in a better way with the COVID-19. They will be looking for health and safety protocols. So they will be looking how hotels or activities, airlines are managing social distancing and sanitize, things like that. So I think what we have seen here in Latin America, we have seen people traveling domestically, and they are starting to travel to international destinations that have their borders open. So New Zealand has still the borders closed, but I think New Zealand has everything that will meet this pent-up demand, because people will be looking for outdoor activities, nature, quiet places, not places with agglomerations. So I think that's what we will be seeing in the future when we are able to travel.
Excellent, thanks for that, Karem. And just while we're talking with our colleagues based in Latin America, how about you, Luis Felipe? What's your perspective on this matter?
Chelsea, thank you so much. And I'm very glad that you are here in Colombia, in Bogota. So I think a time of crisis is a time to innovate. We read an article of the USA Travel Association that says the travel in the new normal is focusing, say, 6 main, main points. First of all, we have to adapt operations to modify employee practice and redesign the public spaces to help to protect the employees and customers. That's the first one. The second, we have to consider implementing touchless solutions where practical to limit the opportunity for virus transmission while also enable a positive travel experience. Third, we have to adopt and implement enhanced sanitation procedures specifically designed to combat the transmission of COVID-19. Fourth, we have to promote health screening measures for employees and to insulate workers with possible symptoms and provide health resources to customers. The next one is to establish a set of procedures to align with official guidance that we should and to work with the employees with the test positive and follow best practices in food and beverage services to promote the employee and customer health. So for us in Colombia, we understand the crisis. After the agriculture industry, tourism in Colombia is the second sector with the highest representation in cluster initiatives in the country. So what we are doing is to help the locals to understand how can we travel around Colombia. And we have many types of tourism that takes place in Colombia. For example, sun and beach, nature tourism, health tourism, event tourism, religious tourism, cultural tourism, wellness tourism, ancestral tourism, slow tourism. So our idea is to expand the offer, and we are working with open calls to help the companies, the tourism companies in Colombia to improve their business with new programs, new ways to access these new markets with the tourism in Colombia. So that's my opinion for right now.
I think that's really important points that you raised there about the variety of tourism opportunities that we have here in Latin America, because I think there's quite a few synergies with New Zealand in those opportunities as well, and what we rely on as an economy to bring in that tourism business. So with that, I'm gonna flick over to Joanna to ask the same question to get your perspective from the wine, food, and agritourism side of things.
Thank you for that, Chelsea. I think we've obviously had some pretty comprehensive responses, and I haven't got too much to add to that, except to suggest that actually, as Professor Pearce said, that depending on what crisis it is, determines the response. So we know, for example, with natural disasters, often the physical infrastructure is returned to normal well before the destination image has recovered. So sometimes there's a gap between the reality of a situation and the image that is held around the globe. And I live in Christchurch, New Zealand. Obviously, New Zealand is very prone to earthquakes, as are parts of Latin America, such as Chile. And in Christchurch, for many years after the massive earthquake we had in 2010, 2011, old footage was being shown, years and years later, footage of buildings falling. So that's the problem. Of course, as has been said, COVID-19 is slightly different in that the whole world's affected. Borders are closed. There is a lot of domestic tourism happening in New Zealand because we can't go anywhere really ourselves. But I think we'll need to wait and see how it plays out. One of the things that has been mentioned by Luis is the importance of maybe rethinking tourism. And there's a lot of emphasis in New Zealand about saying the way tourism was happening prior to COVID-19, there was a lot of concern about over-tourism, and some of our most attractive destinations were being spoilt by too many tourists. So the experience, the environment was being affected by tourism. So while the borders, there may be a lot of demand when the borders reopen, I'm not convinced that tourism as it was prior to COVID is actually the way tourism in New Zealand is going to emerge out the other side. I think there are many communities saying, you know, we really would like to see tourism done differently. You know, we were overwhelmed by tourists and we want to see tourism done differently. And I'm sure Christian might have more to say about that as well. So, and food and wine tourism does come into the mix, and I'll talk about that a bit later.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that, Joanna. And I think I'm really excited as we go through further into this kōrerorero to hear about these innovative ideas and potential for rethinking the future of tourism. So, Christian, before we move on to the next round, any further thoughts to add on this question?
Kia ora tātou. Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here. I think everything that has been mentioned is very much in line with what I'm thinking as well. But I would like to build on the point of, you know, how does the industry and I think government need to adapt? Now, there's no doubt that this has been a massive tragedy, and many families and people have suffered tremendously. And I think partly because of that, we should not miss the opportunity to deeply rethink tourism, to stop, because many tourism industries were put on a pause button, whether they wanted to or not. And it is a sort of a unique opportunity to really rethink, and then, well, reimagine has been widely used as well, but then also reshape. And what I mean by that is that, yes, I also expect a lot of the demand to return, as Doug said. And I think I'm hoping it will be demand that will have different patterns, where we have learned that we don't need to fly somewhere for a 2-day meeting, because actually we managed to do it for 8 months using Zoom and other measures. So I'm hoping that people will be a little bit more cautious and wiser about their choice of whether they need to fly or not, because in the end, 8% of all the world's carbon emissions come from tourism. And that's still a significant amount when we consider that tourism is something that's important, but it's not as important as food. So I think that we need to put into perspective, and I suspect that there will be a little bit of a shift, maybe to more regional markets, more medium haul destinations, where maybe North Americans don't fly to Southeast Asia, maybe they fly down to South America. And equally, Australians might come over to New Zealand, we go the other way. So that maybe there's a little bit of a reshaping of the air traffic market. And you know, it's the same destinations that we're talking about that are affected by tourism that are also heavily affected by climate change as it currently impacts us. And with the forecasts, this is not going to get better. So we need to, I think, also really think about this component. The other point I wanted to make is that as an opportunity to really rethink tourism, we need to think about, what does tourism actually do for us? What, in the context of well-being, what can tourism do in terms of providing well-being to a country? And in that, of course, we have to consider the sustainability in an economic sense. What are the economic well-being benefits that tourism brings? But we mustn't forget the environmental well-being, and we mustn't forget the social and the cultural well-being. And both in New Zealand and in many parts of South America, there are vibrant indigenous cultures that have something unique to offer. And they are not always considered as equal partners in tourism. But the well-being of all communities need to be considered, whether they're indigenous, whether they are what we would more consider the mainstream. And I've been working with some other researchers around New Zealand, and there seems to be a real strong consensus that we cannot let this opportunity pass without trying to adjust the tourism sector into what we, the government, the communities, and the industry collectively want it to be, rather than simply being thrown back on the same tracks that carried us in a direction where we couldn't really influence that direction anymore.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Christian. And thanks everyone for your perspectives on that first round of questions. I think it's great to get insights from both the business and academic sides of tourism. And I know we've touched on it already and we're really excited to jump into this, but I think there is very much this recurring theme of rethinking the future of tourism. It's very important for many and for different reasons that we can find ways to innovate, to adapt, but also make sure that this industry can remain sustainable and prosperous for everybody. So moving into the second round of questions, which focuses exactly on this, I'd like to pose a question specific to each of your areas of expertise to answer directly. So I'll start with Douglas, and I'm wondering, Douglas, if you're able to turn on your camera, if possible. We're getting a lot of comments coming in from our viewers who are very happy about the points you're raising, but some of them are asking if you're able to turn that camera on. So if you can, that would be great. And while you do that, I've got your second question for you. So now in your background, you have significant research outputs that contribute heavily to the tourism industry, not only in New Zealand, but around the world. From this work, you've been able to develop strong linkages with South America, in particular Chile and Brazil. So based on this knowledge and experience that you have, how would you compare the contribution of the tourism sector to the economy in New Zealand with countries in Latin America? And which are the common challenges our countries will face to recover this industry?
Right, in terms of the economic contribution, perhaps surprisingly to many, tourism makes a greater contribution economically in New Zealand than it does to the larger economies in South America. For example, in 2019, New Zealand's international receipts from tourism were over 10 million US dollars, compared with just 6 billion in Brazil. International tourism accounts for about 20% of all our export earnings. And that compares with just 2.3% in Brazil and 4.6% in Chile. Pre-COVID, spending by international tourists accounted for 40% of all tourism expenditure in New Zealand, with 60% coming from domestic tourism. So that 40% from international tourism compares with about 20% in Chile, and I'm told about less than 10% in Brazil. Together, domestic and international tourism generates about 6% of New Zealand's GDP, compared to 1.6% in Chile. So in all of those different measures, the impact of tourism to the New Zealand economy is much greater than those economies of Latin America. And with the continued closure of our borders, COVID is having an impact not just then on the tourism sector, but the economy as a whole. One of the major responses in New Zealand has been to try and increase the amount of domestic spending on tourism to compensate from the loss of foreign exchange earnings. And this has been done through increased promotion led by Tourism New Zealand to generate more domestic demand, trying to encourage New Zealanders to get out and see more of their own country. However, as you'll appreciate, this is a significant challenge, trying to fill that gap, that deficit of 40%, which previously was coming from our international visitors. So the challenge here is much greater than where the international contribution is only 20% or 10% of all the earnings. However, both in New Zealand and Brazil and other parts of Latin America, the challenges pretty much the same. Basically, what the businesses do when all of a sudden your visitor stream is cut off, your income stream is cut off, there are no longer visitors arriving. Commented briefly before about some of the private sector responses, but particularly we need greater input from government. We've seen in various countries the role of wage subsidies, perhaps some tax relief. One of the things which has happened in New Zealand is that the government has brought in a program called Strategic Assets Protection Fund, and the idea here is to protect those attractions in particular which have international and national significance, so that they're there when the demand does re-establish. There's been some criticism of that in terms of its transparency and which businesses have been supported or not, but I think protecting attractions in this time to ensure that they don't fold, they don't go under, is particularly important. And another key issue will be, given that airline services throughout the world have been substantially reduced, is how in time do we re-establish those. So in summary, the challenges are great. We need more than just the individual and collective efforts of the private sector. We need government responses. And the importance of that has been clear in New Zealand, given its overall, the overall impact of tourism on the economy. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks for that, Douglas. It's really good to get an idea of how much tourism impacts not just New Zealand, but our friends and partners over in Latin America. And with that, I'm actually going to jump to Karem next to ask something along those lines. Now, Karem, as country manager for Tourism New Zealand operating in Sao Paulo, you've not only been working to support this industry in New Zealand during this time, but you've also seen the impacts of COVID-19 on Latin America's largest economy, with one of the largest tourism industries in the region. So my question to you, following on from what Douglas has said, is how have the New Zealand and Brazilian tourism industries been impacted by COVID-19, and how might these countries that rely on tourism work together to invest in and support their tourism businesses? And in particular, something that Douglas just mentioned, perhaps the strategic assets protection, that we know Brazil has those assets and those locations that our tourists do like to visit as well.
Thank you, Chelsea. Well, I think, well, Douglas mentioned a lot of the numbers and how much important is tourism for New Zealand. And I think for tourism New Zealand, like to many other countries, our world has changed, and we could never imagine we would have like 0 international arrivals this year. And so our focus as Tourism New Zealand is being on the recovery and supporting the New Zealand industry. This became our priority, as we see tourism vital for the recovery of New Zealand. So just to highlight some of the data that Douglas has already mentioned, if we look at the data before and pre-COVID-19, tourism is the biggest export earner in New Zealand, and 1 in 7 New Zealanders are employed by tourists. So that's a considerable number of New Zealand families who benefit from value that tourism provides. And despite the world around us is changing so much over the past year, our purpose for Tourism New Zealand remains the same, which is enriching New Zealand by maximizing the contribution of the visitor. So this is about making sure that tourism gives back more than it takes to the people and their homes. So tourism enriches the country while providing exceptional experience to both domestic and international visitors. So our role for Tourism in New Zealand has changed through this crisis of COVID-19. We were up until March entirely focused on international marketing. We didn't play a role domestically, part of sharing sites, but now since the crisis and since domestic is still a big part of tourism, we've also become involved in motivating New Zealanders to see their own country. So what's our job now? It's what we are doing is about driving desire for New Zealand's brand with consumers around the world. We want people around the world to desire travel to New Zealand when they can travel, of course. And on the domestic side of tourism, our job is to drive inspiration and action for Kiwis to participate in the tourism economy. So our biggest challenge now is to change the behavior of New Zealanders when it's to travel and act like a tourist in their own country. As John was saying that now New Zealanders are not allowed to travel internationally, so how we make them and inspire the New Zealanders to travel domestically, which is a little bit different. If we look Brazil, the domestic market for Brazil has been always been very important and very strong. So I think it's a completely different challenge for Brazil when we compare to New Zealand. So, and regarding to support the local industry, we have been working on this domestic research to provide an in-depth understanding of New Zealanders' travel desire, attitudes, motivations towards holidaying within New Zealand. So we are also providing professional advice and support to all tourism business through Hallmark's Tourism Advisory Service. Hallmark is the New Zealand Tourism Official Quality Assurance Organization. And this tourism advisory support service uses suppliers such as PricewaterhouseCoopers and Deloitte to come in and work with the business on their needs. So it also includes tools and resources to help grow the business. One example, we have just launched a strong digital capability component. This is a more practical advice and support to improve business online presence. We are also working with Tourism Futures Task Force on an extensive research project called Future-Proofing Tourism to understand New Zealanders' values and views on international and domestic tourism as New Zealand and the world recovers from COVID-19. And I think this is much related to what Joanna said. I think tourism, we need to understand what we will need for the country and as with the tourism impact in all over the world. So the research looks to understand the shifting needs and the attitudes of New Zealanders towards tourism with a focus on future opportunities. And regarding more the international marketing, we have aligned with other government agencies in the country, such as Education New Zealand, to create a global brand campaign called Message from New Zealand. So the idea of the campaign is to reach out the world in a genuine way by sending heartfelt messages of positivity and optimism from locals in New Zealand. So we asked New Zealanders to share a message with people around the world at a time when they can't see them. So we have launched different videos with various messages. I don't think we have time to play the videos, but I know Javier is going to put the link for our digital platforms in Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube link. It's at Pure New Zealand, our hashtag. And as I said before, now we are playing a role in the domestic sector. So therefore, we did some research to understand the New Zealanders consumers. And we have found out that we needed to shake New Zealanders out of the established routine of how they holiday in New Zealand. So we wanted New Zealanders to change mindsets and behavior by adding new to a New Zealand holiday. So we launched the campaign called Do Something New, New Zealand. The campaign is working really well. The Kiwis are connecting really strong, and we have delivered 4 major campaigns so far. And actually today, well, it was last night in New Zealand, but today for us, we have launched like a big splash for the domestic market in all TV channels in New Zealand, a full 2-minute song, as well as interviews and assets for our social channels. We are super excited and we can't wait to see the response of this work and the impact on the tourism industry. So there is much more to share in our strategy and things we have been doing, but I know my time is limited, so I hope I have answered your question, and I'm here and happy to answer any question from the audience.
Amazing. Thank you, Karem. I think it's really interesting to hear about this research that you talk about, because I know that, as you mentioned, Joanna, and I think Christian as well, have commented on how tourism is viewed in terms of well-being and self-development. So I'd like to move on to Christian next, actually, to talk about your work. Feel free to provide input on that element as well. But Christian, your efforts in creating a virtual reality island for experiential education have picked up a bronze medal at the Oceania Reimagine Education Awards, as we mentioned. So congratulations, first of all. In this project, you and your team developed virtual replications of the Yasawa Island in Fiji and Machu Picchu in Peru. Those are two places facing sustainability and climate change challenges to enable users to better understand those challenges. So from this work and the positive response you received for these projects, how could virtual reality and other technologies play a greater role in sustainable tourism for the future?
Thank you. Of course, the first thing is that I've developed it with my colleagues, particularly for education, because the students we are teaching now will be leading the tourism industry in government or as entrepreneurs or as employees for the next 40 or 50 years. So this is possibly the greatest impact we can make in terms of educating. But I do see quite a number of parallels into the broader tourism industry. And I think the best thing is probably to just briefly show you what that actually looks like, because although we use the terminology VR a lot, not everybody is probably familiar with what that might look like. And there are very different flavors of virtual reality, from a very simple sort of cardboard to the very high spec one. So I'll just bring up an image. And hopefully everybody can see this. Oh, sorry, I've got something that popped up. Can everybody see the image?
I can see that, yeah.
Okay, so this is what it can look like. And it's the reality is you will look a bit foolish, grapple with some of the severe challenges which can border on over-tourism. So this is what you might look like, and there's quite a lot of setup around it, but it's also worthwhile to show just what the person sees. So in this case, the person actually sees that virtual environment in Fiji. And the Machu Picchu example looks like this. So we try and bring in the real world with the real people, the culture, and what people think about tourism into these worlds. And we try and do this not in a sort of sounds good, sounds sexy, let's try this kind of way, but we do try and bring in some deeper pedagogy to give it a purpose and give it a motivation. So this is just to show a little bit about the background. And the main purposes for this in tourism as we recover from COVID-19, it's not really to replace travel, because that's what a lot of destinations tend to think, you know, VR, what will be our place in the future? I would look at it more as an opportunity to really enhance travel, because so many times we don't have enough time to prepare for where we're going, to understand the local environment, the culture, or to even understand how we should be behaving if we are guests in other people's backyards and other people's countries. So really, I think the main benefit of this could be that education beforehand, so that people can travel and make more sustainable choices that benefit the destination, but hopefully also they make this worthwhile in terms of staying longer. So we have less of the short trips, which again goes back to the issue of climate change, but we make those trips count. The other thing is, it's really important to understand nature, to understand what is unique about New Zealand, what is unique about Chile's environment, natural environment, what is unique about the cultural heritage, but also what's unique about the living heritage, whether that is Kiwi culture, Kiwiana in New Zealand, Māori culture as a unique culture in the world. All of this we can help and really bring across in a much more meaningful way by using virtual reality. And two more points I would also like to highlight are, one, we need to work more with educating travelers before they head off to destinations. We see stories in the media all the time about people not behaving appropriately. And often I think it is actually ignorance, in the sense that they didn't know better. You would think they probably should, but also it's not easy. I don't necessarily know how to behave in a different culture with every aspect of the nuances in that culture. So there's a real place for codes of conduct. And virtual reality can bring across those codes of conduct in a very effective, meaningful, and sort of an empathetic way, where you talk to people who have been affected by certain types of behavior. They can explain how it impacts them and why it's not okay, which then of course links into New Zealand's Tiaki promise. A lot of countries have launched really prominent codes of conduct or pledges to make sure that tourists know what they need to expect, and that there's a bit of an agreement, there's a deal between the hosts and the guests, how each will behave with each other. But also it would allow people that cannot travel to visit places such as Machu Picchu Pueblo, or if something was developed for Machu Picchu itself, to experience those places. And they might not be able to travel because they have accessibility needs, or there might be other challenges, but it could also open the world in a really effective way.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Christian. I'm really excited to hear about how virtual reality and other technology may play a role in, as you say, enhancing people's tourism experiences and the understandings of where they're actually going and the cultural sensitivities that may exist around those. So with that in mind, on the innovation front, I'd love to jump to Luis Felipe to ask that obviously at iNNpulsa Colombia, you take a strong lead in helping businesses apply that creativity and innovation to succeed. So I'm really curious to hear from you. What other creative or innovative solutions are or may be emerging from the tourism industry in Colombia that could enable these businesses to provide authentic experiences while minimizing personal risk and perhaps, as Christian mentioned, boosting the education and understanding in people?
Thank you, Chelsea. Well, Colombia is the second country in biodiversity in the world, and our national wealth makes us very proud. And internationally, we are recognized for the beautiful rivers, for our landscape, and without a doubt, for the kindness of the people that makes travelers from all over the world fall in love in Colombia. No? So to promote entrepreneurship and innovation tourism sector, we have different strategies. From the Ministry of Commerce, Industry and Tourism, and with the Presidential Office, we are promoting the draft for the General Tourism Law, which integrates several fundamental axes for the transformation of the tourism sector that face of this new normal. For example, to promote sustainable development for the formalization of the competitiveness of the sector with responsible business and reactivation through job protection for incoming generations. With this entrepreneurship law, it is a comprehensive law tailor-made to the entrepreneurs, regardless of the size of their business, with which we seek to promote a more regulatory framework to facilitate the birth of these new ventures and companies, and to help them to grow and encourage the creation of new jobs. So this entrepreneurship law has the following objectives. First, we want to reduce burdens for entrepreneurs and to generate gradualness for smaller scale companies. Second of all, we want to expand market access opportunities through public purchases. Third, we want to diversify and expand financial schemes for all types of entrepreneurship in Colombia. Fourth, we want to strengthen and articulate the institutional framework for entrepreneurship and productivity, innovation, and business development in Colombia. And finally, we want to improve the skills of the entrepreneurs through actions like Christian mentioned in education. Also, we have a plan for tourism in Colombia, with ProColombia. ProColombia is our national exports agency. So also with ProColombia and the Ministry of Commerce, we oversaw the formulation of 4 proposals of 4 key points to achieve the acceleration of this sustainable reactivation in Colombia for the tourism sector. First of all, to facilitate the return of air, sea, and land connectivity. That's the first step. Second of all, we want to help entrepreneurs in Colombia to redesign products and experience that responds to new consumer behaviors. And third, we want to promote a high quality and sustainable tourism, as also Christian mentioned before. And the fourth key point is to promote and strengthen alliance both with institutions and between regions in Colombia to connect and to accelerate the recovery of the tourism sector in Colombia. So we are building right now a national ecosystem for the entrepreneurs in Colombia, in the main cities of Colombia. This national center is called Se Emprende. And the idea in this year, we're going to develop like 10 centers for the entrepreneurs of Colombia for all the sectors, but also we want to work with the tourism sector to connect the academy, to connect the government agency, to connect the private sector, to help them to develop their business. So that's what we are doing right now in Colombia. Back to you, Chelsea.
Thanks so much, Luis Felipe. I think that's really interesting to see how Colombia is planning to connect all those different elements for business in order to support them to succeed. I do remember seeing in 2019 that Colombia was ranking quite highly on the OECD's index for the online government. And I think the information you gave us today really sort of sends that message home that Colombia is working hard to bring business and connect them through digital means as well, and using innovation to help them do that. So that's really cool to hear. And Joanna, moving on to you, I'm really excited to hear your perspectives on your expertise, which touches on a vital element of tourism for both New Zealand and several Latin American countries, which is wine, food, and agritourism. And in particular, you have looked at the role of tourism as a tool for rural resilience in the face of changing economic, climate, and market conditions. So from your perspective, how do you think we could leverage this rich, diverse gastronomic culture in places such as New Zealand and Latin America to bolster interest and engagement in food and wine tourism as we continue to manage the impacts of COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. And I think what I'm going to say probably reflects on what a number of the previous speakers have talked about, you know, the opportunity to reimagine tourism, Christian's point about the importance of considering well-being as being about sort of social and cultural life. And I've also noticed some of the questions coming through around, well, how do we protect our natural environment while also encouraging tourism? And how can we perhaps better incorporate Indigenous culture into tourism experiences as well, which again all ties into this kind of holistic approach to tourism rather than it just being about economics. I think when we think about tourism, a central part of tourism is hospitality, or as we say in New Zealand, manaakitanga. And when we think about hospitality, it's very much connected to food and wine. You know, throughout history, you get together with friends, with family, you share a plate of food, you share a drink, and you socialize and you chat and you tell stories and you connect. And I think, so food and wine's always been a really important part of tourism. At the same time, tourism is all about experiences. And I don't think food and wine is it incorporates all the senses. There's the taste and the smell and the texture. I'm getting quite hungry, it's getting close to lunchtime. But yeah, there's a lot of different textures and experiences that just suit food and wine. And I think what we're seeing is, this idea that perhaps instead of traveling further and having sort of superficial experiences of places, it's the time to stay closer to home or to spend more time in a place and really get to know that place. And from that perspective, food and wine or beer or whiskey provides a wonderful opportunity to what we might say is sort of get a taste of place. you know, so being able to share the food from the ground, from the land, to meet the people who've grown the food, learn about, and of course, food is not just about growing it, it's about culinary techniques, it's about gastronomy. And in New Zealand, we know there's a huge growth and interest amongst New Zealanders in Māori culture. 15 years ago, we probably would have said that, you know, most domestic tourists weren't interested in learning anything about Māori culture, but now there's a real resurgence and interest in learning about Māori language, Māori culture, learning about traditional foods, learning about rongoa, the medicines and the plants. And I think COVID is bringing us back to maybe understanding and valuing a simpler way of life, going back, enjoying nature, connecting with people and places and cultures. And I think food and wine tourism really has the opportunity of doing that. I think the other thing it can do is it really helps with the supply chain, you know, getting local food onto local menus, on getting local wines onto wine lists. And so I think there are lots of opportunities to taste a plate, drink some wine, talk to the winemaker, enjoy the scenery, and just move more slowly through the landscape and with a lighter footprint. And I can see our time is up, so I will stop it there, but there's lots more that we could be said.
Thanks so much for that, Joanna. I'm getting hungry now too. I wouldn't mind a good old Kiwi Sauvignon Blanc, which is very hard to find over here. So thanks everyone for your comments. We do have time for just a couple of quick questions, which I'm really keen to get your thoughts on because you guys have touched on them already. There is a lot of curiosity for this. So I think I'll ask the first question to Christian, Joanna, and Felipe. Luis Felipe, if that's okay. The question is, both Colombia and New Zealand have vibrant indigenous cultures. So how can we draw on these to build sustainable and conscious tourism on both directions? I know we've touched on that a little already. So perhaps Joe, since you're the last to talk, you could kick off.
Yeah, and I did see that question and was trying to incorporate that. Yeah, I think, you know, one thing about tourism is, you know, the cookie cutter destination no longer does it. So yes, New Zealand has beautiful scenery, but many parts of the world have beautiful scenery. What we need to do is develop a tourism product that's authentic to the place in which it's made. And indigenous culture in various parts of the world is absolutely at the core of what makes, well, Māori culture is what makes New Zealand, New Zealand. And the history of 500, 700 years of engaging with this landscape and incorporating that kind of food creates a special product, a special, unique experience that you can't actually get anywhere else in the world. Eating local food, indigenous food, prepared locally by the people who grew it and made it is, you know, is something you can't get outside of New Zealand or Colombia or Chile or wherever those indigenous cultures are based.
A very quick response. We have an instrument, an open call in Colombia called Innova Cluster, and we help all the tourism sector to develop initiatives with the new products, and we have initiatives with indigenous communities, with all the sectors in tourism. So, for example, we have in the Tolima, in the how do you say, a department of Colombia, we develop a tourism circuit with indigenous people to combine ecotourism, adventure, and culture. So, as Joanna explained, we have this kind of programs to help the communities to develop this tourism experience, as Joanna explained before. And our main job in the government is to design these kind of open calls to develop new products and services for the communities with these biosecurity measures, and that's our plans for the next year. Back to you, Chelsea.
Thanks, Luis Felipe. How about you, Christian? Any quick comments to add to those?
Yes, firstly, just to say that the Center of Asia Pacific Excellence, the CAPE, that works with particularly Latin America, is doing some really interesting work in this space, also bringing the indigenous communities together. And they also, in fact, funded my project in Peru. But I would also, yes, the indigenous cultures are super important. I think it is often what makes a place so distinctive, and a lot of visitors also really seek out those indigenous cultures. And I have been working with an organization called WINTER, the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance, for many years now. And I think they would point out that it's not just the indigenous peoples of New Zealand and Colombia, but you have indigenous peoples all through South America, into Central America, into North America. And what they're trying to do is give a voice to all the indigenous communities wanting to engage with tourism throughout the world, all the way into northern Finland, where the Sami people are. And they would also point out it's really important, but it needs to be based on a rights-based approach, that it's the rights of the indigenous people that come first, and then tourism. And that is something that is, I think, both really important, but also New Zealand is still grappling with it. It's not easy, but it is very important to let those stakeholders be at the core of any innovation or tourism product developments.
And if I can just very quickly I add to that, yes, absolutely. We don't want Indigenous culture to be kind of just appropriated, appropriated for a unique selling point. It has to be from the ground up. So I work in the community of Kaikoura, and the Runanga there have said, we don't really want to be involved in tourism, and that's absolutely their rights. And we don't necessarily want our stories told. Again, they are their stories. They have the ownership and the right to tell their stories. And so it always has to be at a partnership, and it has to be a partnership led by the Indigenous people themselves, as opposed to imposed from outside because it makes for, a nice souvenir or a great image on the website.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joanna, Christian, and Luis Felipe for that. Final question. I know we're really running out of time here, but I wanted to ask Karem and Douglas a question we've received on how to rethink domestic tourism, which I know we've touched on in this Kōrerorero, when COVID-19 has generated huge economic crisis in countries, specifically developing countries. So any ideas or final thoughts on rethinking domestic tourism from either of you?
Who goes first? Me or Douglas, Chelsea?
Do you want to start, Karem?
Yes. Well, I think rethinking tourism is what I think everyone has been saying. And I think when we look to domestic, I think there's some opportunities for new products. And I think it's reimagine the products for local domestic tourism, because I think there's different ways of when we travel out of our countries. I think when we are in our country, sometimes we don't want to, and then Joanna can correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes we don't want to pay for the tour guides because we believe we know everything in our country. But I see so much value when we go and have a visit to a winery and have the knowledge of the sommelier or the experience of the local community. So I think we need to create and design new products. I think it's not new products, but maybe adapt to this consumer. And I think this, when we look to New Zealand, is an opportunity for regions that were, I would not say over tourism, but as Joanna mentioned, maybe some of the regions were getting more tourists than others. And when we were talking about international tourism, and with the domestic, if we start to travel around the country, we can reach out all the regions and start to bring more spend to all the regions. And I think we have seen that a little bit in New Zealand. When we look to Latin America, of course, the distance here is completely different. And when we look to Brazil, it's a continental country, and we know that there's a huge impact on the economy. And I think the balance here in Latin America, this is the biggest challenge, is whether you balance the economy and health and tourism. So I think there is a lot of different challenges here. And we have seen people traveling more by driving and changing a little bit of behaviors. For instance, I think in Brazil, we were never much to like motorhomes travels. And now people are feeling more safe traveling and driving on their own cars, on their own motorhomes. So I think there is a lot of challenge that we're going to face in the economy. And of course, we will need the support from the public sector. It's a combination of public and private. I think we need to align the interests between both factors.
Excellent. And Douglas, anything to add there?
I think what we need is much more research on understanding the demand for domestic tourism. And in particular, I think an interesting area there is how has the changing work habits, which we've seen during COVID with more and more people working from home, how does that alter perhaps their demand and what they're looking for when they travel within New Zealand? For example, if they're spending more and more time working from their home office, does this create a demand for greater interaction when they take their holidays? So basically we need the research which has been done into looking at international markets. We need more of that directed towards understanding domestic demand so that then we can better cater for those changes.
Yeah, and if I just can tap to that, Chelsea, I think that's something I've mentioned. We have been doing a lot of research, and I think soon we'll be able to share those research with New Zealanders and broader communities. So I'll let you know when we have the researchers ready to share.
I'm sure there are many people who are very excited to see that research, for sure, by the sounds of it. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us for this Kōrerorero. I'm going to start the closing of the session now. For any further questions in the comments, I see there's a lot of links and emails being passed around for any further questions that our audience might have for our wonderful experts. So please send that through. And so for our Zoom audience, you'll receive the recording of this session in the next couple of days, but also feel free to watch it again on our YouTube channel, Study in New Zealand. I see the link there in the chat, so feel free to check that out. For general inquiries or information about Study in New Zealand, please visit the website, www.studyinNewzealand.gov.nz. For general inquiries about New Zealand, please visit www.newzealand.com. And in the next Kōrerorero, we'll be talking about the creative industry sector, which is a sector I'm personally very excited by. So stay tuned on our social media channels for details. We look forward to seeing you here in Aotearoa, New Zealand when the time is right. And I'm sure we'll see you again online soon. And in the meantime, kia kaha, which is stay strong. So thanks very much again, and over to you, Ed, to close the session for us.
Kia ora, and thank you, Chelsea, for a fantastic job. And on behalf of Education New Zealand, Manapō ki te ao, we congratulate and sincerely thank our panelists for joining, enriching and sharing your perspectives on Kōrerorero rethinking the tourism business sector through COVID today. And last but no means least, we also thank you who took time to view and join us today. But we do conclude with the following karakia: kia tau te rangi Māori o te rangi e tui honei, o papatua nuku e takoto nei o te taiao e awhi nei. Ki runga i a tātou, may the peace of the sky above and the earth below and the all-embracing universe rest upon us all. Haumi e hui e taiki e. Once again, we look forward to seeing you online. Kia haumaru te noho, keep safe, gracias, hei kona mai, bye for now, kia ora and thank you.